All right, you A pushers out there. This is Chapter 17 notes, the first half of them. This is Mr. B History coming at you with more knowledge backed by popular demand. Episode 2, hopefully it's even better than Episode 1. Feeling the flow. All right, Chapter 17 notes, the Last West and the New South. We're going to cover the Last West, and then the second half of Chapter 17 will be the New South. This is covering the Gilded Age from the Civil War to about 1900. The chapter starts off with a great quote from the American historian Frederick Jackson Turner and his frontier thesis, claiming that the frontier was the defining factor in creating American society. So his quote, "The true point of view in the history of this nation is not the Atlantic coast, it's the Great West." Here we go. The West, the settlement of the last frontier. When we're talking about the West, the settlement of the last frontier, we're talking about the Great American Desert. This is west of 100 degrees longitude between the Mississippi River and the Rocky Mountains. So imagine that whole entire area. It's flat, treeless plains, lots and lots of really tall grass. It's known as the Great Plains, and it's got the buffalo. So there was like millions of buffalo roaming it, inhabited by Native Americans such as the Apache, the Sioux, and the Comanche, and many more. It was wild. It was the Wild Wild West. The first group that came out to settle the Wild Wild West was the miners. This is called the mining frontier. This started with the California Gold Rush of 1848. It was quickly followed up by other discoveries of gold and silver in Colorado, Pikes Peak, in Nevada, the Comstock Lode, and in Idaho and Montana, Arizona, and South Dakota. It starts off with prospectors who came out there with just like pans to pan for gold, but eventually these prospectors find the gold was easy to find. It was like right on the top of the ground in the rivers, and they just had to like pan it out using those pans. But eventually mining companies took over, and the prospectors went to work for the mining companies. This creates boom towns. If you think of shows like Tombstone, I don't know if you guys ever watched that movie, but that would be an example of a boom town. The gold rush is what originally pulls the Chinese to come to America. One of the reasons is for the Chinese to work in the mines, which ends up resulting in the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which you'll read about more, or you'll learn about more in Chapter 18, which is about urbanization and immigration. The next group of people who came to settle the West were the cowboys, or vaqueros, the cattle frontier. So there was wild herds of longhorns. This goes way back to colonial beginnings and the Columbian Exchange. So that's a deep cut way back into the way back when the Europeans, especially the Spanish, came over and settled down, and they brought with them their animals. Some of these cows got loose and worked their way into Texas, where they bred, and by the 1800s, there was a significant number of longhorn cattle roaming around the Great Plains, especially in Texas. All you need to do was, if you wanted to make a lot of money, is that these cows didn't belong to anybody. So you just needed to, quote, round them up, like Woody's Roundup, and drive them to the railroad in Kansas to sell them. This became known as the long drive. So, yeah, you just had to put your name on them, and then off you go. So $30 to $50 a cow. You got to remember that Sweatshop Girl was making $5 a week, and she felt pretty good about that. So you could imagine that being a cowboy could be very, very profitable. The long drive ended in the 1880s with the invention of barbed wire, which made it possible for people in the Great Plains to close off their land and make it hard for the cows to go across. Overgrazing, there's too many cows, and then the cowboys eventually, started working on ranches because the people bought the land and then enclosed their cows with barbed wire, and then did not have to drive them all the way to Kansas because they built transcontinental railroads all across the country. This time period from about 1860 to 1880 creates the legend of the rugged, self-reliant cowboy, which became an American icon. Buffalo Bill Cody promoted this idea of the rugged, self-reliant cowboy, and it carries on even to this day to America's team, the Dallas Cowboys. The last group, or at the same time, is the farming frontier. During the Civil War, the Congress passed the Homestead Act of 1862, which encouraged settlement by offering 160 acres of land for free or a nominal fee, but you had to live on it for 5 years and build a 10 by 10 structure, which seemed like it would be very easy to do, but it turns out living on the Great Plains was actually quite difficult. But railroads made it easier, especially the first transcontinental railroad, encouraged settlement of the West. Problems that were for farmers. Farmers on the Great Plains had to be built with sawed bricks. That's bricks made out of grass and dirt, because there was no trees and no rocks either. It was just grass and dirt. That's all they had to build with, so that's what they had to build with their houses with. There was extreme temperatures. You all know from being from Texas. One day it could be 80 degrees, the next day it could be 13. Sometimes there's no rain for a really long time, and then when it does rain, it pours. So it goes from droughts to floods. And don't even get started talking about grasshoppers. They're terrible. And then also just loneliness, hundreds of miles being away from your neighbors or towns. Solutions that the problems that the farmers came up with was barbed wire for fencing, because it was very cheap to buy, and you didn't need a lot of sticks to build it or stone. Dry farming because of the droughts, and then they use windmills to drill deep into the deep wells, because there's always lots of wind on the Great Plains. And then they used the John Deere steel plow to plow up the sod. Eventually, they will build dams and create irrigation systems to have a constant supply of water. The closing of the frontier. The last area of the frontier to be closed was Oklahoma, which was labeled Indian Territory, but in 1889 it was open for settlement. Everyone rushed in, and these people became known as Sooners, and they claimed their land in Oklahoma. The census of 1890, remember students, the census happens every 10 years as prescribed by the U.S. Constitution to get how many House of Representative members each state is going to have. The census of 1890 says that the frontier is closed and that there is no longer any unsettled area in America. This leads Frederick Jackson Turner, going back to our first slide and our quote. Frederick Jackson Turner came up with a thesis which said that the frontier had promoted independence and freedom and individualism. It was a social leveler, which means that everyone's everyone's equal, socially equal when you're out on the frontier. It fostered democracy or self-rule. And provided a safety valve for people who were unhappy with society. So if you had a problem on the East Coast, you could always just go west. With the frontier gone, would America fall into class division and social conflict? That's a question. I guess the answer was no, but maybe yes. All right, whatever. American Indians. When the people came out to settle, mining, ranching, or farming, they ran into the people who were already living in the land between the Rocky Mountains and the Mississippi River. That was the Native Americans or American Indians. There was all sorts of different groups. Remember, you don't want to bundle them all together. We call them, we think of them all as Native Americans, but they were very, very different, and they didn't necessarily like one another. That was going to be a problem that Native Americans had since colonial beginnings. They never really provided a uniform front against the European invaders or settlers. Some famous Native American groups in the West are the Pueblo or Hopi, who lived in permanent settlements and cliff dwellings in New Mexico and Arizona and did farming. The Navajo and the Apache, they're nomadic hunter-gatherers. And any Native Americans that were living on the Great Plains had become skillful horse riders. They hunted buffalo and lived in tribes of around 300. Prior to the Civil War, the government had assigned tribes to large tracts of lands, which were called reservations, but the Native Americans ignored these boundaries. But after the Civil War, prior is before. So after the Civil War, as settlers start moving in, the U.S. government is going to try to enforce these boundaries and these reservations by military actions. This leads to a series of Indian wars. In fact, the last of the Indian wars which is settlers moving west causes conflict. U.S. troops were used to massacre Native Americans and force them to sign treaties. The last of the Indians' War was in the 1870s. There was the Sioux War, which was led by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, which featured the famous Battle of Little Bighorn, where also known as Custer's Last Stand, where Custer and his cavalry were defeated soundly by the Sioux. Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce Indians, and then Geronimo was of the Apache. He was a medicine man of the Apaches. He went from being a fearless leader and raiding villages and terrorizing people to being captured and being forced to play the evil Native American in a Wild Wild West show, and then finally dying on a reservation. So this is kind of the story of all the Native Americans, which is they fought bravely, but unfortunately their fighting was in vain, and they end up moving on to reservations. There was a whole ghost dance movement also, so that was trying to unite the Native Americans to fight the settlers, but it was unsuccessful as well. Assimilationists. Assimilation comes the word assimilate, which means to blend in. Helen Hunt Jackson wrote a book called A Century of Dishonor that exposed the evil of the U.S. government. It created sympathy for the Native Americans, but it also led to the Carlisle School, Indian School. So instead of being like, oh, we should honor the Native Americans and like treat them as things, they were like, no, we should quote unquote civilize the Native Americans and force them to give up their language, customs, and religions and get them to blend in and to become good little Americans. This idea of forced assimilation led to the Dawes Severalty Act of 1887, which forced the Native Americans to assimilate. They tried to bribe them with U.S. citizenship, and the Dawes Severalty Act tried to break up tribes and civilize the natives by trying to get them to be farmers instead of hunters and gatherers, and to stay in one place instead of moving around. The Dawes Severalty Act was a failure, and hundreds of thousands of Native Americans died. The ones that were left just lived on the reservation as wards to the state. This is going to persist all the way until 1934 with Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal, which included the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, which gives autonomy back to the tribes. Latino Southwest, this is coming up to our last slide, so we're doing great here. We're just going to finish this up real quick. Hispanic culture was preserved in the Spanish-speaking areas in New Mexico, border towns, and the barrios of California. As the frontier closes and more people are moving out west, a group of people start the conservation movement. So deforestation and pictures of the natural beauty of the West resulted in Congress creating national parks like Yosemite Valley and Yellowstone National Park to preserve and conserve these beautiful areas for future generations. Other actions for conservation include the Forest Reserve Act of 1891, which regulated the use of national forest. And then there was a special group who weren't just about conservationism, which was conserving and managing the wilderness. It was to preserve it completely. These were known as preservationists. They were led by John Muir. He founded the Sierra Club, and they wanted to not just conserve nature, but preserve it completely free of human interference, so that the animals could live there without being bothered. And this brings us to the end of our notes, or are halfway through the notes for chapter 17. I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure you like, subscribe, add, and ring that little bell. Leave me some comments. Appreciate all of you. Remember, this is not a complete replacement for reading the chapter. You still should read the chapter. There's lots of good information in there. This video ran a little bit longer than my past videos. So let me know in the comments if you like that or you don't, or if I should try to hurry up. Until next time, pushers, go get that knowledge. Mr. B, out.